welcome those of you who are guests among us. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're not regular around here, there are restrooms on this level, the level above us. There's a men's room right out here on the left, going out that door, a women's room, the first hallway on the right, a gender-neutral restroom upstairs. There's signage directing you to all of those if you need to use one of those while we're here. Also, I hope you got a Holy Conversations card on the way in. It says Holy Conversations Series 2017. We've done a couple others of these series, but I just wanted to remind us a little bit about why we do it this way. As Methodists, we follow sort of many things that John Wesley did, who we consider the founder of the Methodist movement. And one of the things he called the means of grace, or a spiritual practice, was holy conferencing or holy conversations, where we ask questions and then we try to answer those together. That was one of his practices. If you know that he was an Oxford scholar and taught logic and philosophy, you can understand why he thought asking questions and then discussing the answers was a good idea. That's how he was trained, that's how he thought. If you read his sermons, you find that that's how he writes his sermons. They look way more like what we would think of as essays than what you would think of as a sermon today. But at any rate, Wesley kind of sets us the model for holy conversations. I've prepared this card just to remind us of the context in which we're in. On the front, it says Holy Conversation Series 2017, has our church logo there, and then gives us a couple of foundations. One is all people are children of God, and two, love of God and love of neighbor are at the center of all that we do. And then on the back, there's some guidelines in terms of how we proceed here. We want to honor the sacred words of all persons. We want to seek to do no harm. We want to respectfully listen to learn. We want to explore the sources of our differences with goodwill. And at all times, we want to be kind to one another. As together we humbly seek the mind of Christ and to do the will of God in all we say and do. We really do want to listen to learn. This is not a debate. None of these sessions will be a debate. This is not a pro and con, and we'll divide up and get on our sides or take a vote. That's not really how we're approaching this. We're really approaching it as a conversation where we have questions, where we have opportunities to learn, where we can share with other people within the Christian community and hear their perspective, just as the early Methodists did, and we believe that's a great way for all of us to grow. Tonight we're talking about what the Bible does and doesn't say about human sexuality. People quote a variety of things out of Scripture. You may have heard that, particularly on the topic of human sexuality, in terms of people pull a phrase here or a phrase there and will tell you that's what the Bible says and that settles it. What I find in those discussions or conversations is often the passage has been taken out of context and is used in a way to reinforce what someone already believes rather than looking at the whole of Scripture. We have a great speaker tonight to come and address this for us. Dr. Lisa Davison is here. She teaches Hebrew Bible at Phillips Theological Seminary. She teaches around town as well in churches, like she's coming to help us tonight with this. Lisa started her graduate education at Lynchburg College, got her BA there, went on to Bright Divinity School, which is in Texas, and got her Master of Divinity. She went on from there to Vanderbilt and got an MA, and then she got her PhD also at Vanderbilt University. She came to Tulsa and joined the Phillips faculty in 2010. She's also an ordained Disciples of Christ or Christian church pastor. She's a member of a variety of academic and Bible society groups. She's written a whole variety of things, written in Bible commentaries of different sorts, written essays on the major prophets, wrote the commentary for the book of Job and the New Interpreter's Study Bible. Her book is Preaching the Women of the Bible, as well as other things she's written for magazines and periodicals. But she's perfect for us, not only because she's local, and I happen to be in an interfaith dialogue group with her, so it was easy for me to catch her and kind of wrangle her into this. But she is a professor of biblical studies, particularly focusing on Hebrew Bible, but she also focuses on the Christian use and misuse of the Hebrew Bible. So I think that helps us as well. Plus, she's done quite a lot of work in terms of women in the Bible and sexuality in the Bible, as well as a variety of social issues around justice. So she, I think, is ideally suited to come tonight and help us all learn more about Scripture as we explore this evening. Let's have a moment of prayer, and then we will hear from Dr. Lisa Davison. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for creating us, for bringing us to this moment, for Christian community and the importance that is in shaping and forming who we are and how we live in the world. Help us to be faithful, O God, to your call upon our lives, whatever that might be. So in whatever we say and do, we are ready to embody your love for the world and all of your creatures. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Let's hear Davison.
Hello. I want to thank David for the invitation. He really didn't have to wrangle very hard. This is a topic I've been working with for about 20 years. And so it's something I am passionate about. But I also want to thank all of you for taking time on a Sunday evening to come here. I know there's often football on Sunday evenings and other things we might rather do. So it's encouraging to me that you're all here and willing to engage such an important topic for our time. The way I approach the topic for this evening is to look at what have been called the clogger passages, texts from both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament that are used as supposedly condemning people who may be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or some of the other options that we know of today in how we identify different people. There are only about 9 or 10 of those out of the entire Bible. And so I find it helpful to look at biblical texts, see what they're actually saying, look at the context, and try and figure out what we can glean from that. I'm not trying to convince someone to believe a particular way, but I am trying to help us look at what biblical texts there are that often I think have been misquoted and misused. So to begin this way, we're probably going to need to dim the lights. Yeah. If you go to sleep, I understand. It's not a problem. I like to start out by sharing with the group my understanding of how I approach Scripture. And part of that is just starting with what is this thing we call the Bible? Lots of people have lots of different answers to what is the Bible. My approach is to start with what it's not first. In my understanding and from all my scholarship, I do not think the Bible was written to be a, quote, objective, end quote, history. That is, I don't think the people who put these stories together and made certain they went from generation to generation were trying to tell us just the facts, ma'am, and only the facts. Rather, this is a story told from a particular perspective about how they interpreted the world and the events around them. But I also like to point out that sometimes we get the wrong idea that history is somehow just facts, and that there is such a thing as objective history. There really isn't. Because every time someone sets about to write a history of anything, they have to choose what facts to record, they have to interpret what happened, and they end up with slightly different variations, sometimes really big variations on interpreting events. That's why we have so many histories of one event. I use the example, I grew up in Virginia, just south of the Mason-Dixon line. If I went to the library and got a book on the Civil War that was written from someone north of the Mason-Dixon line, and then got a copy of a history of the Civil War written by someone south of the Mason-Dixon line, I think two different events were being described, because they're told from different perspectives. The other thing that the Bible is often expected to be, and I would say is not helpful or respectful of the text, is a science textbook. Sometimes we look to the Bible to answer our most intriguing scientific questions, like what does the Bible say about stem cell research? It doesn't say anything about stem cell research. They didn't even know what a cell was. So a science textbook in the way we think of it today is not what the Bible is trying to offer us. Rather, there are some other ways of understanding the Bible that I think are much more helpful. First off, the Bible is, I don't even have it up here, but the first thing I would say is a library. It's a collection of books written over different time periods by different people with different views about who they were and who God was and how the world worked. So within the Bible, you find all sorts of genres. Short story, you have poetry, you have prose, you have chronicles. So it's like a library. It's also, I think, the story, an overarching story, of people who claim to share the same ideas about God, a common heritage, and common hopes and dreams. For the Hebrew Bible, this was the Jewish people telling their story of their life with God. And then for the New Testament, that early movement after Jesus, that were trying to talk about what they had encountered in this amazing person and how that affected lives and could change the world for people in their time and place. Certainly, the Bible is a theology book. It's talking about God all over the place. It's not systematic in that it gives you different answers in different places about whether God is all-knowing and all-powerful or self-limiting and waiting on human choices to know what's going to happen. I think of the Bible as a roadmap that has been left by previous generations for those that follow, so that we might know we're not the first to take this journey. We're not the first to ask big questions like, why are we here? And why do people die? And also I think it's a roadmap left for us that we might learn from successes and learn from their mistakes. I also think of the Bible as a mirror. That is, we can often hold it up to ourselves and find our place in the story. And if we're honest, sometimes the place we want to be in the story is not always the place we really are. And so the mirror can help us see where we are falling short and when we are doing well in following the way of Jesus and being faithful to the Holy One. It is a compilation of many, many voices across time periods, centuries. But we also know that not every voice got into the Bible. So we always want to talk about whose voice is not heard and what that might add to our understanding of God and God's activity in the world. And it is a dangerous book. I have my first Hebrew word. You're going to learn Hebrew and Greek tonight, just a few words. The first word is tameh. And I talk about the Bible being dangerous in many ways, but what I want to stress here is that when the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, a group of Jewish leaders got together trying to determine how they were going to continue when their community had been split and their place of worship no longer existed. And they talked about different scrolls that had made their way into the community as words of wisdom. And the rabbis that gathered, they talked about which books we might put in the Bible and which books they might leave out. And the test of this practice was to ask if this scroll made the hands unclean. Now, I think today, if we heard that a text made the hands unclean, we tend to think that it didn't make it into the Bible, because we think unclean and dirty. But the English there is translating this word tameh, and tameh in Hebrew means altered, in a different state, not in your normal state. And actually, it was the exact opposite. If the rabbis thought that the scroll made the hands tameh, unclean, it was considered holy, and it got into the Bible. But holy in the sense that it had the power to change lives. So when we approach the Bible, and when I try to teach about it and interpret it and share it with students, I want us to remember that the Bible can have the power to give life, and it can have the power to deal death. And those of us who handle it have to be aware of how it can be that dangerous book in our hands if we're not careful with what we do with the text. The other thing I like to talk about is who wrote the Bible. Again, lots of people answer the questions different ways. There are some people who would tell you that God wrote the Bible. This might be like my mom, who believes it fell from heaven in the King James English, as is, red letters and all. Now, I'm not picking on my mom too much, because she's the reason I do what I do today. Because she read her Bible every single day, and I wanted to be like my mom and do that too. But some people do believe that if it didn't fall from heaven, at the very least, God held someone's hand while they inscribed the words coming directly from God. There are those who would say that humans wrote the Bible. And I'm talking about people who say it was purely human, there was no divine intervention, and in some ways there are theories out there, like one guy named Tommy Thompson believes the Bible was put together by the Persians after they had defeated the Babylonians, to give a common story to the different people who had existed in Judea, and to help them feel united, they created this book that we now call the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament. Now, Tommy Thompson's a way out there guy, and I'm not saying I believe what he said, but there are some people out there that the Bible is just another book. And then there are some, and this is where I fall, even though it sounds like I'm straddling the fence, that the Bible was a combination of divine and human elements. Sort of like a dance between the divine and the human. There could be divine inspiration behind these words, but they had to go through a human instrument. A human instrument that was subject to all our human shortcomings, as well as their own historical, cultural context. And so these words might have started out really great, but by the time they got out there on the page, they may have been altered some. And so we see this dance, and in some places the holy shines through, and in other places I think the holy got covered up by human ego, human prejudice, and other elements that could affect the way the texts were recorded. But how you answer that question about who wrote the Bible also says a word about authority. What is the authority of Scripture? Now, I know a little bit about Wesleyan theology, and I know about the quadrilateral. It talks about 4 sources of authority: Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. So most people in this room would say that the Bible has some sort of authority for them, perhaps. But we need to remember that authority is granted or recognized. It's not inherent in the text itself. And so we all make a choice whether to grant authority to Scripture or not, and what kind and how much authority does the biblical text have on our daily lives and our decisions and actions that we take. So one of the things I like to talk about is that when we go to public square and we start having debates about topics and people start quoting Scripture, and they can't figure out why that doesn't win the argument, it's because there are people there who don't hold the Bible as authoritative for their lives. We have to keep that in mind. some of us, if we're honest, have a canon within a canon. And if some of us may just really want to read only the New Testament, come take a class with me, I'll change that. That was once a heresy by a guy named Marcion, and we thankfully won that battle. But there are certain texts that I think we all prefer and we like to read. So again, when we're looking at Scripture, we also bring into that experience reason, tradition, and our own experience. All those are part of that equation. Now, how many of you have heard someone claim that they were a biblical literalist? And you may have claimed it yourself. Well, here's the thing. There are no true literalists in this world, not biblical literalists, because, well, if the Bible is just read, as they often claim, and then applied to their lives, then my guess is you'd be really confused after a while. Because there are some inconsistencies. Just within the book of Genesis, how many animals went on the ark? We all were taught 2 by 2 and came off 3 by 3, right? Well, maybe not everybody sang that song, but I did. There's actually 2 answers. In one place it says 2 of every kind, in another place it says 7 pairs of every clean animal and 1 pair of every unclean animal. So you'd have a hard time just reading and taking the Bible literally. We all interpret. The very act of reading is interpreting. The very act of translating is interpretation. We can't get around it. So I like to think that some of us who might want to claim to be a literalist may need to back off and rethink those words. So I'll give you an example from my own experience. I've had encounters where people wanted to have a Bible citation battle with me. And they have told me that they take the Bible literally, and they start quoting things like Leviticus 18:22 and Romans 1:25 to 26, and they just keep saying, I take the Bible literally, literally, literally. My next step is to say, okay, I hear you. You take the Bible literally. Yes. Well, let me ask you a question. There's a story about Jesus telling people that they should sell everything they have and give it to the poor. It doesn't look like you've done that yet. And I swear, these are the words I hear. He didn't mean it literally. Really, all of us are selectivists. I got this word from another scholar, but it works pretty well. We all select which text we're going to take literally and which text we don't think apply to us anymore. The question is, how do we make those choices? Why would we take one text literally and the next text not take it literally? Well, there are lots of ways to answer that question, and in my line of work, we call that your hermeneutic. The hermeneutic of how you interpret Scripture, a framework. How do you determine what to take literally and what to not? Or as my former colleague, Dr. Dennis Smith, used to say, what is timeless and what is time-bound? How do you make those choices? Well, sometimes I'm afraid we make those choices because we are concerned about what steps on our own toes. If the text doesn't step on my toes, sure, it's literal. But the moment it starts messing with me, he didn't mean it literally. So, this interpretive framework is something that we want to have, be able to identify, and to apply consistently. And part of that is also recognizing your reading location. That is, who you are and everything you bring to that encounter with the Bible affects how you read. I read the Bible differently than a woman in Africa. And we all have to recognize we don't come to the Bible as a blank slate. That doesn't mean we can't try to put that to the side. and study text for as much information as possible. But that's part of our hermeneutic. And so just to be fair, since I'm going to be going through biblical text very quickly this evening, I want to share with you my hermeneutic. And it's kind of funny because it works well with David's card and what's on the front of it, and we didn't plan it this way. But I seek to follow the way of Jesus, by the life and teachings of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels as best we can figure out. And there's one thing that I find most compelling, and that is when Jesus was asked, what are the two greatest commandments? The first greatest commandment, he said, anybody remember? Love God with all your mind, with all your might, or I'd just like to say, love God with all you are. That came from Deuteronomy 6. He didn't make it up. He pulled it out of the Torah. And what was the second commandment? Love your neighbor as yourself, which actually comes from Leviticus, of all places. Leviticus 19, verse 18, the second part. So whenever I read text, I'm constantly asking, how does this help me love God with all I am and love my neighbor as myself? Well, I deal with the Hebrew Bible, so I'll give you a bad example. When it says, go and kill all the Canaanites, and it does say that, I ask myself, does that really teach me to love God and love my neighbor? Probably not. So do I get to throw it out? No. I'm not Thomas Jefferson. I don't get to make my own Bible. Rather, what I have to do is study even harder to figure out why those words would be written down in Holy Scripture. A different example, later on, it also says in the Torah, love the stranger, for you were once strangers. Now, does that help me love God with all I am and love my neighbor as myself? Yeah, it does. But I still have to do really hard interpretive work to make certain I'm not trying to force it to say something I wanted to say. So trying to apply your hermeneutic as to why things are literal or not literal is very important. The work I do then, and what we call it at the seminary, is the fancy word exegesis, which means to draw meaning out of the text. Now, it's a fancy word, but we do exegesis every day. When you read the newspaper, an article online, when you watch a movie, when you look at art, you're exegeting something. We take the biblical text and we try to draw meaning out rather than read meaning into it. So the first question I want to ask is, what are the words of the text? What does it actually say? You know, I hate to break it to a lot of people, but when it says that Eve tempted Adam with an apple, that's not in the text. There wasn't an apple and she wasn't tempting. It just said she gave some to her husband who was with her. And apples wouldn't have grown in that part of the world at that time. So just getting back to what the words say versus what you've always heard the words say. And of course, if you don't read Hebrew and Greek, you're having to rely on a translation that is already an interpretive move. So just looking at the text. What kind of literature are we reading? We read legal text different than we read a short story. What's the genre? What do we know about the socio-historical context in which those passages were being compiled and written? How does it function in the rest of the canon? Is this kind of like a strange thing that contradicts everything that came before or after it? Is it related to other parts of the Bible? What ideology or ideologies are expressed in the text? What am I supposed to believe about what is right and wrong and who is God and what my role in the world ought to be? And always, whose voice is not heard? And how might that change our interpretation? And then, after I've done all that really fun exegesis, students don't find it so fun, but I love exegesis. After I've done all that hard work, then I need to ask, okay, what does it mean for us today? And I'll be honest with you, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, I don't think every story was recorded as a go and do likewise story. I think there are stories that have been kept to shock us, to make us think, how are we doing that in our own time and our own place? And how are we going to learn from our ancestors' mistakes? So with all that said, let's talk about sex. I know that's why you came. So, sex in the Hebrew Bible. There's some things that sometimes Christians carry around with them that aren't prevalent in the Hebrew Bible. For example, sex is not inherently bad. In fact, human sexuality is a God-given blessing when shared between consenting adults. If you think about it, the first command God gives to human beings is, be fruitful and multiply. Well, to be fruitful and multiply, you have to have sex. It's about companionship. And it is about this idea of how to become one in some sort of sacred act that for the Hebrew Bible, sex is sacred. God is a part of that as much as God is a part of your prayer life or any other activities. If you don't believe that, read Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. It's a bunch of erotic love poetry that got in the Bible somehow. And it's a great thing if you're trying to get younger people to read the Bible. Read a snippet of that and then tell them go find it, because it's so small it's hard to find, so they'll have to look at some other things that are in the Bible. It's also a pretty good thing, rather than saying, just say no. What if you said, well, just be aware, God is with you in that back seat. Whatever you're doing, God is a part of it. But sex, like many gifts, has the potential to be harmful, especially when it's used to abuse or demean another person. Now, a little bit about the ancient Near East and sex and procreation. Remember, they didn't know what an egg and a sperm were. So how did they understand procreation? Well, first off, survival of a people was of priority importance. A famine, a drought, a plague, or a war could wipe you off the face of the earth, and Israel was never a very big country, a very big population. For women, pregnancy and childbirth were extremely dangerous. Many women died while giving birth. As I said, Israel was never a large population. Infant mortality was very high. Some estimates 80 to 90% of infants in the ancient Near East never made it past the age of 3. So procreation was imperative to keep the population growing. Israel was an agricultural community, so their understanding of procreation was agriculturally based. The seed and the field. So for their understanding, the man's seed had everything necessary for life, and the woman was simply the field in which he planted the seed. A field that he owned. That's very clear. So if the seed is planted and a boy child is born, who gets the credit? The man. If the seed is planted and a girl child comes about, who gets blamed? The woman. Even though we know that's not true, but they just assume that there's something wrong with the field because the seed's always good. And if the seed gets planted and nothing grows, it's obviously the field's fault, and that's why women are called barren, like barren land. So we have to keep that in mind. And seed then couldn't be wasted because it was so vital. It had to always go towards the possibility of reproduction. There's a great story in Genesis 38 about a man who spilled his seed upon the ground and God struck him dead. That tells you how important seed was. And that'll come back up later. Now, the Hebrew Bible and homosexuality. First thing we need to know is there's no word in Hebrew for homosexuality. Neither is there a word in Greek, or a word in Aramaic, the three original languages of the Bible. In fact, the English word didn't come into our language until the 19th century. So the first kind of warning, if you read a translation of the Bible and it has the word homosexuality in it, that's a huge interpretive step that your translator made, because there's not a word that equates to this one in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. Biblical writers either assumed that everyone was heterosexual, though they probably didn't have a sense of sexual orientation, because life was really about survival. Everything was about the seed and where it could be planted and how it was to be used. We do know that there were same-sex acts in the ancient Near East. Evidence shows us that in that time, and maybe later too, that often when an army would conquer their enemy, they would rape the enemy. Not because they were attracted to the same sex, but because we know rape is violence and it's degrading. Because in their mind, if a man raped another man, the one being raped is playing the part of a woman. And in that culture, men did not want to play any kind of part that was considered a woman because of its incredible androcentrism and anti-women ideas. We know that there were religions both in around ancient Israel and the Greco-Roman culture of the New Testament that practiced ritual sex acts, temple prostitutes, fertility religions that often would celebrate spring by having sex in a ritual way. And then we know, particularly in the Greco-Roman culture, of a practice we call pederasty. This is when an older man would keep a young boy for his sexual pleasure, exploitation, abuse. We would call that pedophilia today. So we know those practices were going on in and around the cultures that the biblical texts reflect. But we're here to talk about something different than rape or pedophilia. We're looking at different contexts and different understandings of humanity. So let's get right to the clobber passages. I often have been at rallies in which there's some shouting going on, and there's usually a sign that reads, "God created Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve." It's a really catchy slogan, but there are so many problems with that. And here's why. The two creation stories, the one in Genesis 1 where everything's orderly and there was evening and there was morning, etc. And then the one starting in chapter 2, verse 4b, where we have this dry land and God makes a human out of dirt, a dirt figure out of dirt, an earthling out of earth. And the human is first and then animals are created. Now, these two stories, if we were to identify their genre, some might call them myths, and I know that's a four-letter word in the church. So, I like to think of them as parables. They're stories told to teach lessons. And behind it, we're not worrying about, like when Jesus told this story of the Good Samaritan, we didn't want to, expect to find the social security number of the Samaritan. It was a story to teach a lesson. Both these stories are trying to answer the questions of how we got here, why are we here, and what is it we're supposed to do. And they're also trying to explain how the world came to be and how all these people got here. So in that ancient context, if you're trying to populate the earth, to be fruitful and multiply, what is it you have to have? You have to have a male and a female. You have to have seed in a field. They couldn't figure out any other way to do it. So, of course, to start the world, you're going to create a male and a female. But notice that those aren't words about sex, they're words about biology. And be fruitful and multiply, go ahead and do that. The other text we get in there is therefore a man shall leave his mother and father and cling to his wife. Now, the question should come up, where to get a mother and a father? And where he's going to get a wife? And the other thing I like to tell people is in Hebrew, there's actually no word for husband or wife. It's the word for man and woman. So wherever it says his wife, it really literally translates as his woman. And wherever it says her husband, it literally translates as her man. Now, I like that, but some people didn't find that helpful. There's also no word in Hebrew for marriage. Rather, the word used typically is lakach, which means to take. A man takes a woman to be his woman, like you would take someone's property. So this story about how we came to be and how we got people beyond two human beings that were created first is not really an appropriate text to go to address questions about sexual orientation in the 21st century. Because if you really want to get into these stories and ask those kinds of questions, there's some bigger problems we got to deal with. Like, where did Cain go to get his wife? Did he marry his sister? Ooh. Or did God create some other people? Just said God created two here, maybe God created more people. So I typically dismiss this one because, again, it's not about whom you love, it's about how you're going to get more people on the world, on the earth. The one that gets the most attention is Sodom and Gomorrah. Oh dear, that's what got me into this practice. I actually wrote a letter to the editor about what Sodom and Gomorrah was actually about, and it wasn't homosexuality. So let's look at this text. Genesis 19 is part of the saga of Abraham and Sarah. Genesis 19 talks about Lot, who is the nephew of Abraham. But in Genesis 18, you have to read that story first before you can read 19. Because also the chapters weren't there at first. They were added later. So were the verse numbers. So in Genesis 18, you have the story of the three strangers who come to visit Abraham and Sarah. We know they're angels, but Abraham and Sarah don't. And they show them this great hospitality. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was a must, an expectation of the highest caliber. Because in the ancient world, there wasn't a Motel 6 to leave a light on for you. You needed people to take you in, and hospitality, it required that you give someone water, food, and shelter. And once you took them under your roof, their safety was your responsibility. So Abram gets these three visitors to come and have some food and rest and drink some water. Now, of course, it was Sarah who was doing all the work, but that's another story for another time. And they tell them that Sarah's going to have a baby even though she's 90, and Sarah laughs a bit. That's another story for another time. But at the end of the story, you have Abraham taking the three guests and walking them towards their next stop, which is the city of Sodom. And we are given information into the brain of God. God has heard the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's such terrible things being said about them that God needs to go check it out. But if it's true, God is going to destroy them. Well, God decides to share this with Abraham while two of the guests keep going. And in the midst of this sharing with Abraham, Abraham's like, oh my gosh, God, would you destroy the innocent with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? God, would you destroy them just to get the wicked? And God says, no, you're right. I wouldn't destroy the cities if there are just 50. Well, Abraham keeps bargaining. What about 45? What about 30? What about 20? And each time God's saying, yeah, I'll save the cities if there are that many people. Abraham gets God down to, if there are just 10 righteous, innocent people, God says, I won't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. The scene ends. And we turn the page to Genesis 19. And the story tells us that those two strangers that are angels come to the city of Sodom, and Lot just happens to be out in the city square. And when he sees these two strangers, he says, come to my house. I will show you hospitality. And they're like, no, we'll just sleep here. And Lot says, no, it's not safe to sleep in the city square. So they finally agree to come to his house, and they have food and shelter, and they are about to lay down and go to sleep for the night. And this is the New Revised Standard Version, and it says, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, and all the people to the last man surrounded the house and called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them. So, the picture is painted. All the men of Sodom are at Lot's door wanting to have, and no in Hebrew really does mean sex too often, wanting to have sex with two strangers. Even if this is the scene, what are we talking about here? Rape, violence. They are strangers in their city, and that's how they're going to treat them. And maybe Lot knows this all too well, and that's why he was out looking for anybody who needed shelter. But here's the problem. Translation is everything. And when you go back to the Hebrew of that verse 4, Genesis 19, and you read the words there, you learn something important. When the people of the city, the people of Sodom, from the youngest to the eldest, all the people of Sodom to the last one surrounded the house. The Hebrew uses the phrase kol ha'am, all the people. It never means just men. It always means everyone. So now look at what we've painted, a picture of everybody in town, outside Lot's door, young and old, children and grandparents, everybody is there wanting to rape and abuse the two strangers. Why couldn't we translate it this way to begin with? And here's another reason why this translation matters besides who's outside Lot's door. What did God say would save the city? 10 righteous, innocent people. Now, if it had just been the men, God would be willing to destroy all the women and children, who surely were more than 10. But when we have the proper translation, everybody is out there. There's not 10 righteous people in the whole town. In this view, there are only a few. There is Lot, his wife, and his daughters. That's it. And that's why Sodom and Gomorrah get destroyed. And unless we think Lot is all that great, when they demand the strangers be brought out to them, he says, hey, here's my 2 virgin daughters, take them instead. Father of the year? But in ancient culture, the protection of the stranger was more valuable than your virgin daughter. I know. So there's a lot going on here that we have to think about. But also, if Lot knew they were only looking to have sex with men having sex with men, then he wouldn't have bothered to offer the 2 daughters. Because it's not about sex. It's about violence. And just treating these people as objects rather than as human beings. So, what we have going on here is this story of how this town treated the outsider. Everywhere else we hear about Sodom and Gomorrah in the entire biblical canon. The sins that are identified as Sodom and Gomorrah are things like greed, abusive behavior, idolatry, and inhospitality. Never does it say the sin was men wanted to have sex with men. And I think if we talk about abusive behavior, gang rape would fit that category. And Jesus gave us the perfect understanding of what it was about Sodom and Gomorrah that was so bad. When he sent his disciples out, he said, if any city doesn't welcome you, shake the dirt from your sandals, because it'll be better in the day of judgment for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Clearly, he knew these stories were about inhospitality. And they became sort of the code phrase for that. All right, moving right along. I got a lot to go. I hope we'll have questions, and I will give you a handout at the end. So, the next two texts come from Leviticus, and I just need to tell you a few things. In the Hebrew Bible, there are 613 commandments. They were meant only for Israel, not the rest of the world. They were to help Israel be different from their neighbors and to reflect the God they worshiped and love of God, self, and neighbor. They were not a buffet. It was all 613, none of them. You couldn't go up and say, I want 5, 225, 375, and 612. No. Keep them all, or don't keep them at all. And I think some guy named Paul said Christians didn't have to keep them anyway, but somehow Christians keep wanting to pull out 2. And why those 2? Well, the book of Leviticus is a text that's really about priests and priest teaching for the people. I'm going to skip this slide because it's not that great. It has a lot of instructions about how to worship, how to sacrifice. There are only 2 narratives in the whole story. It defies our understanding, but basically chapters 1 through 16 addresses the priests. Chapters 17 through 27 focus on the people. So, our 2 texts, Leviticus 18 and 20, come from a section called the Holiness Code. It's part of this whole collection. So let me tell you a little bit about the Holiness Code. Here's what it requires. A child be killed if he or she curses their parent or sasses their parent. I don't know about you, but if we held that one as literal, I wouldn't be here tonight. Anyone guilty of adultery should be killed. Well, I imagine Hollywood would be a lot sparser in its population, and probably Washington, D.C. as well. And I'm equally applying it to anybody, not any particular group. A daughter of a priest who engages in prostitution should be killed. Well, we don't even know what to do with this. Anyone who uses the Lord's name in vain should be killed. Now, this doesn't just mean when you say the GD word, where you ask God to damn something. I can't say the GD word because that's what my mother told me was the worst cuss word ever. But rather what this means is don't use God's name for things God doesn't want to be a part of. Don't just throw God's name around like, oh, God gave us the victory on the football field. If you really want that, I'm a TCU fan. I happened to be in Stillwater last weekend. I thought it was just sheer luck. God had nothing to do with that. But again, these are all in there, but we don't keep them. Here's some things it prohibits. You can't have heterosexual intercourse with a woman who's menstruating. You can't harvest the corners of your field. You have to leave something behind for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. You can't crossbreed livestock. I think there's like, what is it? A donkey and a horse make a mule. That's prohibited. You can't eat fruit from a young tree. And there are no tattoos. I remember, it's all or nothing. And you can't charge interest on a loan. Now, I like that one. But I'm pretty certain my mortgage company won't buy it. So let's look at these 2 texts. Leviticus 18:22 and 20, verse 13. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. In Leviticus 20, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, and they shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Or a more wooden translation would be, with the male, you, as in a male, shall not lie the lying of a woman. If a man lies with a male the line of a woman, the two have done an abomination and shall be put to death. Now what's going on here? Well, first, we're wasting seed. If two men have some sort of activity and the seed is filled and there's no fertile ground to plant, then that's dangerous to the whole community. So here's the thing. Lesbians are not mentioned at all in the Bible. It's good news for lesbians. Not you never hear anybody say that, but why are lesbians not mentioned? Because there's no seed being wasted. Another thing that I point out with that more wooden translation is the point that the second male, the one doing the lying of a woman, is having to act like a woman. And that was a horrible insult. Because women were weak, and women were not fully the perfect image. I mean, all these things that could go on in a male-dominated society. So, no wasting seed, and someone has to be the woman. Now again, 613 commandments, and we have these two. And notice, where did Jesus get love your neighbor as yourself? Right between the two. Leviticus 19. Alright, the other thing I underlined was the word abomination, because that gets people there. Oh, it's an abomination. It's the worst sin ever. I actually heard a minister call my friend, who happened to be lesbian, an abomination. So let's look at this word. It's toivah. And toivah is a word used mostly to talk about ritual impurity. The things that alter you so you can't go to the temple and worship. And there are a lot of things identified as toivah. But here are a couple. Eating a sacrifice at the wrong time was an abomination. Eating pork or shellfish is an abomination. Do you like your lobster? You like your shrimp? You like your bacon cheeseburger? It's an abomination. Seeing a menstruating woman naked is an abomination. So what's the point? Why would we take these two and keep eating our hamburger and our ham and our lobster and our prawns? Because those things step on our toes. But these two are easy to pull out. But that's not how it works. Either all or nothing. Now, that doesn't mean we can't learn some good things. And like I said, Jesus did kind of reach into the middle of those two and say, love your neighbor as yourself, as the whole importance of all those commandments. That's it in the Hebrew Bible. Now we're going into the New Testament. And a few things change. During the time that the New Testament was being written, the early followers of Jesus that became the church was a minority group. They were a new religion that was suspect by the Hellenistic Greek culture. And the greatest threat to that community was outside influences. Being tempted to go after other gods, because it was a polytheistic culture that the Greco-Roman world had put forth. They were fearful of assimilation. And tried to prove their legitimacy as a new religion and carve out their own identity. Early leaders of this Jesus movement, like Paul, tried to emphasize the sins of Greek religion, especially when they incorporated sexual behavior as part of their practice. So anything that even hinted at that kind of Greek culture had to be strictly prohibited. Because this new community was not like them. Just like Israel was not like their neighbors, the new community was trying to be different. So when we turn to the New Testament, there are 4 passages That's it, and two of them are almost identical. But I like to stop first and ask a question. What did Jesus say about homosexuality? Nothing. Nothing. He said a lot about greed and envy and judging other people. He didn't say anything about this. We go to Paul. Romans 1. Paul is writing this letter to Rome. It's one of his masterpieces. And so we read it today. Remember, he wrote it as correspondence, not thinking anybody'd be reading it 2,000 years later and making it Holy Scripture. So we have to keep that in mind. He's writing to the church at Rome, warning them of the temptations out there, and the biggest one was idolatry. And so in chapter 1, he's talking about what happens to people who follow after other idols. Not necessarily other gods, just anything that takes your attention away from God. And he says, when this happens, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own person the due penalty for their error. That might sound a little simple, so let's look at the text. The Greek phrase that is translated as unnatural is parathysin. And Paul uses this in several places, like in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 14. He says men with long hair is unnatural. I thought Jesus had long hair, didn't he? Likewise, women with short hair like me, going to be unnatural. Really what we think that word meant was unconventional or unusual. But not, again, this against nature idea that we often read into it. Rather, what happens is when they're chasing after these idols, they start falling into the practices of Greco-Roman culture. And one of those happened to be drunken orgies. And probably what we have described in Romans 1 is some sort of orgy fest, where a bunch of people are having sex and it's all about their own pleasure and not about how sex is supposed to be. And if anything, we should pay attention to the fact that there are other things that God gave them over to. And one of those that gets mentioned in the text is, I'm sorry, I went backwards instead of forward. Envy. Anybody got some envy in here? Gossip? Well, we never pay attention to that. We've always just focused on these words. Probably, I think, if anything, is referring to heterosexual couples breaking their bonds of marriage and going against their own nature for just their own physical pleasure. And not about committed relationships between people who are attracted to someone of the same sex. Not what we're talking about. Then the other next two texts are sinless. Not less, but less. Sinless. What is it that's going to what is it that will keep you from getting to heaven? 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, which we believe Paul wrote, and then 1 Timothy 1, 9 and 10, that should be 9, not 1, which we believe someone later wrote in the honor of Paul, but much later understandings of the church are reflected in Timothy than in Corinthians. Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom. And then in 1 Timothy 1, 9 and 10, this means understanding that the law is laid down not for the innocent, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the godless and sinful, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their mother and father, for murderers, fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching. Now you notice I have italicized 3 words. In the 1 Corinthians text, male prostitutes and sodomites. In the Timothy text, the word sodomites. Because I want to talk to you about these translations. The word translated as sodomite is the Greek word arsenokoitai. Now, is sodomite supposed to be related to the city of Sodom? Wouldn't you expect the word in Greek would have something that sounded like Sodom? Arsenokoitai? This is a hard word to translate because it's not used. We think Paul actually made it up. And the closest we can come up to is the arsen is Greek for man. And the second part of the word, koitai, has to do with beds. So it might have something to do with male prostitutes. So Paul's talking about pagan religious practices. But there's a problem, because if I went back here and did male prostitutes, then we think maybe Paul had like a scratch on the record in his head. So let's look at that other word. Male prostitutes is used as the translation of the word malakoi. Malakoi means soft. Jesus talks about people who like soft clothing. They're wealthy. They're royal. And it actually has more to do with being lazy or weak, which in that culture was associated with characteristics of women. Remember the anti-woman nature of so much here. So what if we translated that as laziness? Uh-oh. I'm lazy. I'm soft sometimes. I'm weak sometimes. So how did we come up with sodomite? And many other newer translations have used the word homosexual, which remember I said, it's not in Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic. Even the NRSV, one of the best translations in my lifetime, uses sodomite. The RSV talked about sexual perverts. And the Bible that God wrote, the King James Version, does not use any of those sodomite, homosexual, any of that. Now, of course, homosexual wasn't a word when King James was having his translation done, but there were other words he could have used, and he didn't. So I can tell you what happened with the NRSV. I know one of the translators, or I knew him, he's passed away now. The NRSV was done by an ecumenical interfaith translation committee using the best text we have and using a formal correspondence translation approach, word for word, trying to get as close to the original meaning as possible. Well, it was done by a committee. And committees are made up of people. And when you have people, you get politics. And I know from this story from Dr. Harrelson that there was a debate. Some members of the translation team wanted arsenokoitai to be sodomite, even though they knew linguistically that was incorrect. But ideologically, they wanted it to say sodomite because in our world, sodomy and sodomite have different meanings than just someone from Sodom. So it was a tit for tat. They got that translation, and the other side got a different translation. Now, I've never found out what the tat was for the tit. That sounds so bad. But I have been told that according to another scholar, New Testament scholar, Warren Carter at Bright Divinity School, his student told me that it was worth it, that the trade-off was worth it. I find that hard to believe. Because if that word wasn't in that text, or those two texts, we might not be having some of the arguments we're having today. And then the last text, Jude. Nobody reads Jude very often. It's a weird book. And it only has one chapter, so that's not Jude chapter 7, that's just Jude 7. And the writer is talking about things of the past and references the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it says, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which in the same manner as they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural lust, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Now, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah doesn't say eternal fire. It was just a fire and it disappeared. So what's happening here? Well, sexual immorality. If what was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah was gang rape, that's sexual immorality. And that unnatural lust, same word, paraphisin. But what's even more important for the writer of Jude is that the audience would have known that those two guests that they wanted brought out for their abuse were men. Weren't men, they were angels. And in the ancient world, at least for the Judeo-Christian tradition, angels or divine beings and humans weren't supposed to mate. So the whole point was humans wanting to have sex, a rape scene, with angels. And if you don't have a real sense of that, go back and read Genesis 6, 1 through 5, where it talks about why the flood happened. And the sons of God saw the beautiful human daughters and they mixed together. That's one of the reasons for the flood. That's all. That's all. So I wanted to take some time for questions. I know I threw a lot at you because I'm from the South, as I mentioned earlier. I usually talk very slowly. But you just heard tonight what some of my students experienced, that when I get going, I can go really fast, and if I don't have to stop, I will keep talking for an hour and 15 minutes without ever pausing. So, what questions or comments do you have? Yes?
I was thinking earlier, I don't remember which book in the Torah was mentioned, that it mentioned about the cross-dressing.
Uh-huh.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's a Deuteronomy text about cross-dressing, and particularly about men wearing women's clothes. And what we think was going on there was that if men wore women's clothing, they could sneak into the women's quarters and attack women. And that was a threat, not to the women, but to the men that owned them. So, I'm sorry, it's just the truth. Property. And if you had sex with another man's woman, you were trespassing on his property, not doing something to the woman. Yes?
Yeah, when the angels came down to see Abraham, God said he heard Sodom and Gomorrah's cry. What was the cry? Why would God come down for that judgment? What was the people Sodom?
We have no idea. It doesn't tell us, except when we look at the other texts that mention what was wrong in Sodom and Gomorrah, like greed and bad behavior. And it's interesting because the same kind of language will be used later when it says God heard the cries of the people of Israel in slavery and came and did something about it. But in this particular story, the other thing we have going on is God has heard these things, but God needs a first-hand report. Because this is serious business, so that's why God sends out some spies to see if it's as bad as it seems. Now, since then, some of the rabbis have suggested what might have been going on, and usually it was things like abusing people, always worried about what's in it for me, selfishness, those kinds of things. But the Bible doesn't ever say that in that story.
But it was significant when he actually came out of her.
Yes.
So it was a serious.
It was a very serious problem, and I think the story sets it up. What's Abraham's opinion on that? Yeah. And we know that later, when the whole golden calf incident happens and God wants to wipe them all out in the wilderness, Moses goes to God and says, no, you really don't want to do that. That wouldn't look too good. You brought them out of Egypt only to kill them in the wilderness. So there was this understanding that sometimes humans could engage in that kind of dialogue with God. Other questions, comments?
The revision of the Bible where they put in the Sodom. What decade is that?
The New Revised Standard Version was done in the late 80s. So it was, I want to say fairly recent, and then sometimes I remember that was, like 30 years ago. That's about the time I realized I've been doing this 21 years. I'm like, oh my gosh, but yeah, it came out, I got my copy when I graduated seminary in 91.
So it was being done, when he was in practice in the 70s.
80s, I would say, most important. And so if you go through searching all the different translations, you get all sorts of things there. But some of the ones that are most favored, as like the King James, doesn't use the word sodomite or anything like that.
I think it says perverts.
And male abusers of themselves, which would probably be masturbation. I should have warned you all, when you teach Hebrew Bible, you just have to get comfortable with talking about sex and body parts and bodily emissions. It's just part of the text. I can't do anything about it. If I clean it up, then you really don't know. And we've cleaned it up enough already, trust me. What else? Yes?
Well, what Bible, you talk about the King James Version leaves a lot of that out, but that one's very hard to read.
Yeah.
So what is one that's more relevant and easy to read now that it translates more into the Hebrew, like what you're talking about?
That's a great question. And every translation has pluses and minuses. So other than these two texts in Corinthians and Timothy, I would tell you probably the NRSV, though it too doesn't indicate that all the people came knocking on Lot's door. I haven't found any translation that did that. I'm the only one, so I guess I better publish my own translation. Though I tell people if one person did a translation, that's suspect. But I suggest a couple of different translations to kind of compare and contrast. For the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Publication Society, Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K, is an excellent translation. It's still dated, but it has less of the Christian overlay in Hebrew Bible text that other translations have. I think the New Revised Standard Version is good for the most part. I like the New American Standard Version, which is a Roman Catholic translation. They do an excellent job with poetry in the Hebrew Bible. The New International Version, it's going to have more of that evangelical fundamentalist approach to it. There's a contemporary English version that I don't have a lot of connection with. So what I tell people is when you go to choose translations, ask yourself these three questions. Who did it? Was it a group of like-minded individuals or a diverse group? What did they use? Did they take advantage of every Hebrew, Greek, Latin, all these different Aramaic, all these different manuscripts we have, including for the Hebrew Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls? Or did they just look at a few? You want them to take advantage of everything there is to compare, because different manuscripts differ. On some things not so important, other things rather important. And then what was their translation philosophy? And I talked about formal correspondence, where you try and get a word in the new language for every word in the original language. The other one is dynamic equivalence. And dynamic equivalence is where you recognize that some words don't translate well, or some phrases don't translate well, so you work towards the sense of the language. Now, my preference is formal correspondence, but it really does render some interesting things. In the King James Version, again, my mother's favorite version, I got so excited to come home and tell her that her least favorite word, piss, P-I-S-S, was in the Bible. But there is a place in the King James Version where it talks about he that pisseth against the wall. It's in the Hebrew Bible, yes. And it means men. It's an idiomatic phrase for men. Because I think they're the, well, I won't get into it. But boy, did that tick her off, and she almost didn't let me go back to Lynchburg College, that damn Keys. So even formal correspondence can render some really weird things. And luckily with the New Revised Standard Version and some others, when it gets awkward like that, then they move into more of a dynamic equivalence. And I know this isn't what people want to hear, but I say this to seminary students. Learn the languages. Because then you're no longer reliant on someone else's interpretation that happens in translation. Mine does it, theirs. Now, the text with Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, I've looked hard and far to see, and I can't find any reason why my translation doesn't work. And even the NRSV said all the people, but before it said men, and after it said men. And so it kind of like didn't make sense to begin with, which was it. But every translation is going to have an interpretive move. So get a couple of different ones. Yes?
So if we all stuck with your mother's Bible, would we be having the issues that are appearing right now?
Some of them, yes. Because Leviticus is the same kind of stuff, but that's 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, and the Timothy text, we wouldn't have had sodomite in there. And that, or homosexual that shows up, and that seems to be a place that a lot of people go right to. That in the Romans text. I have a quote, I didn't put it in this PowerPoint because it's from Alexander Campbell, who was one of the founders of my denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And he said something to the effect that more arguments in the church have been had over what the Bible doesn't say than what the Bible actually says. And that's what I keep seeing here. And again, I'm not telling people how to think on the topic, but I don't think we can rely on saying, well, the Bible says it, I believe it. Unless you want to sell everything you have and give it to the Lord. So, anything else? I think we have one more minute. You all have been so generous. Yes, ma'am. I said, ma'am, I know her. I'm sorry. It's just my southern upbringing. Sorry about that.
Okay, and maybe you said this, but is in Hebrew theology about eternal life?
Uh-huh.
I think I heard this somewhere, so I want you to clear up the gossip.
Okay.
But for a man to have, if there isn't like an afterlife heaven, but man's life was carried on, man, not women's, I think.
Okay.
And they're taught the sons that were born.
Yes. Yes.
So isn't that attached also to you don't spill your seed because you're spilling the possibility of your eternal life?
Yes.
If there's no child born out of this, that whole seed, and something about the whole human being is in that seed.
Yeah. Yes.
Did I put things together that weren't there, but
No, I think what I would say is, yes, in the Hebrew Bible, there's no evidence that they worried about an afterlife. They worried about getting things right in this life. There's some hints there might be something after this life, and I love the phrase, the euphemism, gathered with your ancestors when you die. which in my mind is the big heaven family reunion, but I don't think that's what they meant. But yes, having offspring was your heritage, was the way that your name didn't die. And that's why they go to great lengths to make certain a man's name didn't die. So if he dies without a male child, then the brother has to marry the woman and all that wonderful stuff. So yes, the one thing that I love to point out though, because we Christians like to think that those commandments were set in stone. Okay, nobody's gonna, I know it's a long time. Only 10 were set in stone. But even within the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we have a story in Numbers in which that kind of law got changed to meet a new situation. In Numbers 27, we meet a man named Zelophehad who died in the wilderness with no sons, but he had 5 daughters. Bela, Hogla, Noah, Tirzah, and I can never remember the last one. I get them all, but never in the right order. I call them the Z sisters. And when the land was to be divided in the new promised land, these daughters realized they weren't going to get an inheritance because they didn't have any brothers and they weren't married. So they went to Moses and said, you know, Moses, our dad died in the wilderness, not because he rebelled against you, it was something else. And now, since he has no son, his name will not be carried forward, and he's part of the tribe that Joseph is a part of. And they're really smart. They don't say it's not fair to us. Like, you wouldn't want that to happen, would you, Moses? And Moses was stumped, and thankfully took it to the higher court. And God says to Moses, their plea is just. They should get an inheritance. And in fact, God says, from now on, if a man dies without any sons, but he has daughters, they get the inheritance. Before that, it would have gone back to a brother, an uncle, or something. So even within the text, we have laws being adapted to changing circumstances. And Judaism knows this practice. The halakha is like all these different, every time society changes. And we need, I think, to start thinking about some of those things we put into stone and what needs to change with our time and place. And again, what we're going to take literally and what we're doing. You all have been good. Our time is up. Thank you so much.
Did you learn anything tonight? Thank you so much. Appreciate you so much. So did you hear the one about the lawyer, the social worker, the doctor, and the minister walked into a room? Okay, that's what's going to happen next week. It's on your welcome card here. We're going to have a panel discussion, particularly around the issue of what it means to be transgender. I've had more people in the last few months as I've been raising some of these issues, ask me to bring some people that could help them understand what it means to be transgender. What do the doctors and the scientists and people who have worked with this understand about this whole experience. So we're bringing a group of people who can do that for us. So that'll be next Sunday night, right here, 6 o'clock till 7:30. All right? So go in peace. Thank you so much for coming.